Hello, lovely podcast people, and Happy New Year. This is the second podcast I have wished a Happy New Year on, but the one I did yesterday didn't record. It cut out halfway through, so I had to regather my thoughts. It's one of the most frustrating things when that happens. It was really good as well. So Happy New Year. I hope you're well. Thank you so much to everyone who listened to the last episodes over the Christmas and New Year period and left reviews on the podcast app or on iTunes or online or wherever it is. Really, really appreciate that. This podcast is, I don't know, is it a wisdom one? Is it a nutrition one? Not entirely sure. It's fairly off the cuff. In fact, it's very off the cuff. And it's about, I just want to discuss some stuff about low carb or specifically, I suppose, ketogenic diets. It's come from a few different conversations I've had. It's a relatively musing podcast. And part of it came from just a new study that came out. It was quite an interesting study, actually, just in terms of the study design, which I won't bore you with. But essentially, it's stuck a little bit of a dagger in some of the silly or bold claims that the low carb / keto crew make. And there's often this idea, and I think I've mentioned this somewhere in a podcast before, but when I have done Instagram posts, and that have maybe reached a slightly wider audience, people who aren't aware of me, and they just jump in and go, well, actually, you don't know anything. My laptop's going off here. I'm not even using it. Let me just, you don't know what you're talking about. If you go away and educate yourself, bro, you'll know that ketosis is the only way forward. And, when people do keto, it's this whole idea that like counting calories is somehow bad for you. And I saw some of this in the New Year diet rubbish that gets posted around in newspapers and magazines, like big mainstream media. And, there was this registered nutritionist, I'm going to say it just to remind people that being a registered nutritionist, these people aren't being regulated well and they are still talking utter rubbish. And, this person, I think, has sold out for a company that has this weird and wonderful way of losing weight that has nothing to do with calories, and essentially talked about, and using the same tactics that keto zealots use, in that when people diet and count calories, even if they do manage to lose the weight, they always put it back on, completely ignoring the fact that there's no evidence of a better way to lose weight and keep it off outside of, well, actually, rapid fat loss. If we talk about the real evidence, if you had to pick, the evidence currently suggests this, that if you had to pick a way for a group of individuals to lose weight, and you want the greatest number of individuals, you want your team to win, to have maintained the most amount of their weight loss, or, in terms of, say, percentage weight loss, you would use a rapid fat loss protocol like I talk about. I don't push that fact too hard because I like the idea of individualized nutrition and people picking what works best for them, which is a very difficult thing to do because we don't have good objective ways of going, do you know what? Low carb would be good for me because XYZ. Low fat would be good for me XYZ. Even some people go, you need to let the client pick their own diet. And actually they've researched that and it doesn't help, which is mental, that giving people the choice to pick which they would prefer doesn't result in a better outcome in my head. I can also reason why not being able to pick might work better, but it's just surprising, right? So, if you needed to win a bet and you had to pick a way of, and you had two groups of individuals, you would use a rapid fat loss protocol time and time again. It's been shown to be the better method in people who have a significant amount of fat to lose in the long term, in the short and long term. Anyway, so, what the farcical information used in these newspaper articles and people, the type of people who are paying for big articles in the New Year papers and magazines saying, calorie counting doesn't work and you need to do it in this special way that nourishes the body, or you need to be in ketosis because then you'll lose the weight and keep it off. It's not the case. Like, the studies are there. Like, keto doesn't mean you lose weight and keep it off in a different way to calorie counting or any other method. And that's also not to say that there aren't people out there who calorie count and keep it off, or, the idea that all diets fail is not true, as I've spoken about recently elsewhere. What we do know is intensive behavior interventions, behavior change interventions are really, really positive and help with things. Exercise interventions help with weight loss maintenance. So anyway, this study looked at people who lost weight, and the essential conclusion, I probably should have written it down actually, was something like the greater degree of ketosis that someone is in after the diet, the greater the level of metabolic adaptation. So just to remind or to tell you what that means is there was and this is at the resting metabolic rate level. So there was a greater slowing of metabolism above and beyond what we would expect anyway from someone just weighing less on a diet. And I think the individuals on average lost about 14 kilos on these diets. And you know what, I'll make sure that the link to this study is in the show notes as usual. I hope I made a note of it. But yeah, the greater degree of ketosis that these individuals got into, the greater the reduction, the greater the metabolic adaptation. So the greater the reduction in their resting metabolic rate. Now, it's all much of a muchness in terms of, for me, I wouldn't use that to go, you shouldn't do this way of dieting. But it just shows us this idea that, well, if you do keto, if you do low carb, that's the best way and you'll lose it, and it keeps your metabolism high because you're eating as much as you want, you're eating to hunger. This is the way people reason it with stuff that sounds like it makes sense. You're not counting calories, you're not restricting yourself. Well, you are. This person here is restricting calories specifically. You're restricting an entire macronutrient, which leads to you restricting calories. So, in this study, actually, they did restrict calories, but that's by the by. The point being that this idea that, ketosis is the thing you need to be in because it's the natural state of the body, for instance, is another one of these. Really? That's the natural state of the body? Okay. So the other thing, that reading that news study was just like, oh, that's interesting. I want to talk about this, and some other conversations that have happened. In this idea that I often get asked about keto for individuals with PCOS, and I had a doctor actually reach out to me asking me about this. And, in conversations, people will go, the evidence for type 2 diabetes, type 2 diabetics, or blood glucose management with keto, is very strong. Why don't you therefore suggest it, for individuals with insulin resistance? Why don't you therefore suggest it for PCOS? And so they're almost setting up the question sometimes with this false premise, which I've spoken about before. If you start with a false premise, you can kind of prove anything. Or if you start with a false premise, it really, really will confuse you about other stuff. So if you start with this false premise of, keto and low carb is the best thing for individuals with prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, you end up leading yourself completely down the wrong track. I've spoken about this before, like, and it is, there's this thing called the macrobiotic diet, the MAPI, capital M, little a, capital P, little I. If you type that into Google, it's, if you're a geek and look into it, it's just very, very interesting macrobiotic diets. It's comes from the sort of very plant-based vegan world, but just really, really astounding results in these studies. Very high carbohydrate diets, reversing type 2 diabetes. And, we can, again, 800 calorie diet, look at showing some reversal. And whatever, if we reduce ectopic fat deposition, visceral fat, we're improving insulin sensitivity, weight loss in general. But, we can improve things with a very high carbohydrate diet. We can, the Kevin Hall, I feel funny every time I mention him now because I just talk about his studies so much because they're so fantastic. But 70 or 75% carbohydrate in non-athletic, non-athlete, non-exercising individuals, and compared to that was in the whole food plant-based diet versus keto study. And, these loads and loads of carbohydrate. People going, if you eat loads of carbs, it'll make you hungry and you end up eating more. Like, no, not true. That isn't a fact. Stop saying it across the board. I know when I previously posted on my Instagram, if someone doesn't exercise, can they eat a high carbohydrate diet without issue? And loads of people are like, no, they can't. They cannot. You need to earn your carbs. It's just not true. Get your head out of that mindset, whether you're a nutritionist, dietitian, personal trainer, general population individual who's been led to feel that way or think that way. It is not true. You don't earn carbohydrate. You don't, I'm not talking about people like, oh, you don't earn your calories. That's going to give you an eating disorder. Like, fine, that's a discussion that needs to be talked about. But I'm not talking about it, earning it in that way. It's just that eating low carb and getting more calories from fat because you don't do sport or loads of exercise isn't a thing. You can be just a normal, regular person and eat a high carb diet and it doesn't give you insulin resistance. It doesn't give you diabetes. It's not a thing. Okay. I don't know how more simply to put that. But yeah, just this idea that keto might be magical for that isn't a thing. And there was another thing actually I just wanted to talk about. No, maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know what this podcast is going to be called. I just wanted to give you some musings. Someone posted on their story today, one of my, I think it was episode 27, Adam. Thanks, Adam. And it was one of the wisdom ones. And so it's just kind of like talking about this stuff, giving you some knowledge. Hopefully that's helpful, changing mindsets around things. I'll leave it there. In fact, I'll just finish with this. So one of the questions, it was like, why don't you like keto? What have you got against it? And it's just the idea is like, it's not special in from an insulin resistance point of view. Like, slightly reducing carbohydrates in some instances might be useful for some individuals, right? Getting into ketosis for some individuals might help with appetite reduction, but that's not specific to, the reversal type 2 diabetes. That's a much bigger issue to do with, energy poisoning, visceral fat deposition, whatever. We're just looking for ways for someone to stick to something and maintain it. But there is also this issue of, if you're not eating carbohydrate, yes, we can look at, okay, what's your blood glucose like? Right, you're not giving any glucose, so it's not there. Okay, in the short term, there might be this just transient benefit of going low carb or fasting or whatever. Very, very transient. Getting blood, muscle glycogen, liver glycogen just down a little bit, because that becomes like this sort of like overflow. What's the word? Like, I don't even know what, like in your sink, right? Before your sink overflows, there's that little hole at the back. And there's this overflow thing that just kind of catches it, so that the catastrophe of water going all over your bathroom. That's kind of like what your liver and your muscle are for blood glucose. Like when we have slightly depleted muscle glycogen levels, and in particular we've just done exercise, we even get this like non-insulin, insulin independent glucose transport. So there's blood glucose floating around the system and it just hops over into the muscle and chills out in there instead of floating around in your blood, which we don't necessarily want it to be in there for a long time. And if you've got super high blood sugar, the body ramps up blood glucose burning to get rid of it, because it is, in the long term, toxic. If it stays high for a long time, it's toxic. This is why there are issues with uncontrolled blood glucose. So there might be this benefit like in the short term. But then, when you go super low carb, you're not actually, the system isn't really learning to function normally. I say learning, but it's you get a level of what's called, like people term it, physiological insulin resistance, because your body then you're not giving glucose, and then you need to just keep the system steady and not put if your blood glucose into muscles, you need to keep it in there for your brain. And so you might, if you do an oral glucose tolerance test, which basically is like how well you deal with a bolus of glucose, people who've been doing low carb do worse. We know in athletes who eat low carb, they can't use carbohydrate well. They're not able to use their glycolytic system well. So actually being able to eat carbohydrate, stimulate insulin, carbohydrate gets burned off or stored, is good. And then the system reverts back to what's called your respiratory exchange ratio, goes back to more of a zone where you're burning fat for energy at rest in the what's called the post-absorptive state, or I guess fasted state, if you want to call it that. What was I saying about, why did I start talking again? Yeah, there's nothing special about it. And I think that's the, people, why are you against it? There's also this thing of it's not a great way to live long term. So yes, if it is a strategy that really, really works for that individual, that's a discussion. But just knowing that it's not something that we're going to do long term because it's not appropriate. And all the stuff that we're learning about the gut and dietary fiber, it's important to realize that it's probably an actual negative effect if you were to do it long term, because we're not giving the body this dietary fiber variety that it likely needs to function optimally, because you can't just get this good variety of fibers from green veg alone. Your fruit intake is limited, and other foods with all of our different fiber types in them that likely benefit, serve as prebiotics for our healthy gut bacteria, or, etc. We've got a lot to learn in that area, but really, even based on what we currently know, it's a good idea that we're not doing keto as a long-term strategy. So, and if it doesn't offer us any really big benefit, then just why would we recommend it as an option, a first line option, or a the best option, when it just simply isn't? And for instance, I was asked, I gave a kind of range of, have carbohydrate roughly in this range. And it was like, well, what about slightly less than that? And I was like, well, no, because I would have told you if there's any benefit of going slightly less than that, I would have said that. It's just this idea of, if I just keep bringing carbohydrate down, is there just not a bit of an extra benefit? Like, no, there isn't. Anyway, cool. I'll leave it there. Some interesting stuff, I hope, for you keynos to listen to. Happy New Year again, and I've got a few cool episodes coming up from listener questions. A fair few episodes all dedicated to listener questions. Topics like collagen supplements, such a big one. Any of you practitioners, I'm sure you've had questions on these things for hair, skin and nails, gut health, that kind of jazz. On collagen, some stuff on supplements, micronutrients. Yeah, anyway, cool. Until next time, much love.